The ground beneath our feet remembers things we have forgotten. In the vast, silent spaces of the American wilderness, there are whispers older than any map and forces that move according to rules we will never comprehend. You're about to hear stories that blur the line between memory and nightmare. Enter the world of true horror stories and subscribe, but only if you're really not afraid. Seriously? The Geyser Patrol Ranger, Mark Kenway, considered the geothermal basin his parish, a sprawling cathedral of steam and silence that he patrolled with a quiet reverence. He knew its rhythms, the timed exhalations of the major geysers, the subtle shifts in the air that foretold a change in pressure deep within the earth. For 15 years, this section of Yellowstone had been his responsibility, and its nocturnal landscape was as familiar to him as the lines on his own hands. The August night of 1997 was no different. A crisp, clear evening where the starlight felt sharp enough to cut glass, and the steam from the vents billowed like ghosts against the obsidian sky. He was conducting a standard overnight survey, a routine check for vandalism or visitors who had wandered off the boardwalks, a task that was usually more about solitude than security. His truck was parked a half-mile away, its engine ticking quietly as it cooled, leaving him alone with the symphony of hissing fumaroles and the gurgle of superheated water. He felt a deep sense of peace in this environment, a place where the planet's raw power was on constant, magnificent display. He believed he understood it, that he had earned a level of familiarity that bordered on intimacy. That belief was a comfort, a shield against the profound, ancient darkness that surrounded him. But shields, he would learn, are made to be broken. It was just after 2 in the morning when the anomaly occurred. A sudden and violent disruption to the basin's delicate choreography. He was standing on an overlook, sipping coffee from a thermos, when a sound ripped through the quiet. It wasn't the familiar preamble of Old Faithful or Grand Geyser, but a deeper, more guttural roar that seemed to come from the wrong direction entirely. Mark spun around, his professional instincts overriding his surprise. About 200 yards out, across a stretch of pale, barren earth known for its instability, a column of water and steam erupted into the night. It was a massive event, a plume he estimated at 40 feet high, illuminated for a stark, terrifying moment by the brilliant moonlight. It was powerful, angry, and completely unscheduled. He fumbled for his radio, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He keyed the mic, his voice steady despite the adrenaline. "Dispatch, this is Kenway, Unit 7. I am witnessing a major, unscheduled eruption in the lower basin, Sector 4. Approximate height, 40 feet. Stand by for coordinates." The radio crackled back with static, the signal weak and intermittent in the geologically active area. He repeated his transmission, this time shouting over the roar of the geyser, which was already beginning to subside. He watched, transfixed, as the column of water fell back to the earth, the steam dissipating into the cold air. The entire event lasted less than a minute. Then silence returned, deeper and more profound than before. He marked the location on his topographical map with a grease pencil, a precise X on a patch of ground that should have been dormant. He spent the rest of his patrol in a state of heightened awareness, his senses straining against the darkness. The familiar sounds of the basin now seemed alien, menacing. He felt watched, a feeling he hadn't experienced since he was a rookie. The incident report he filed at dawn was met with professional curiosity. A new vent opening up was not unheard of, but an eruption of that magnitude appearing overnight was a significant geological event. His supervisor, a man named Henderson, with a healthy dose of scientific skepticism, told him to lead a survey team to the site as soon as the morning light was strong enough. Mark led them back to the overlook, the X on his map a point of absolute certainty in his mind. He pointed across the barren ground. "It was right there," he said, his voice confident, 100% certain. But as they approached the area, a cold knot of dread began to form in his stomach. The ground was undisturbed. There was no crater, no newly formed cone of cinder, no fractured earth. The pale, cracked soil was exactly as it had always been, a sterile landscape where nothing grew. Henderson walked the area, his boots leaving faint prints in the crust. "Mark, there's nothing here," he said, not unkindly. "Maybe the angle of the moonlight played a trick on you. Maybe it was a reflection from another geyser." Mark shook his head, his certainty unwavering. "No, I saw it. I heard it. It was right here." He spent the next hour walking in frantic circles, his eyes scanning the ground for any sign, any piece of evidence that would validate his senses. He found nothing. The other rangers looked at him with a mixture of pity and concern. He was a veteran, not prone to flights of fancy. To them, his insistence was more worrying than a phantom geyser. Desperate, Mark made a decision. "I'm taking soil samples," he declared. "If 40 feet of boiling water shot out of the ground here, it left a mark. It would have scalded the earth, sterilized it." It was a rational scientific response to an irrational situation. He collected samples from the exact spot he had marked on his map, and for control, he took more from 50 yards away. The lab results came back a week later. Henderson called him into his office, a strange look on his face. He slid a single sheet of paper across the desk. It was the analysis from the samples Mark had taken from the supposed eruption site. The report was concise. The soil was almost completely devoid of microbial life, a level of sterility consistent with being flash-boiled by water well over 200 degrees Fahrenheit. The control samples, by contrast, showed a normal, thriving ecosystem of thermophilic bacteria. The evidence was irrefutable. Something had happened out there. Something had superheated that patch of ground, just as Mark had claimed. But the physical proof, the crater, the vent, the source, did not exist. The official report, NPS Incident Log, from August of 1997, logged the event as an unexplained thermal anomaly. It was a sterile, bureaucratic term for something that defied explanation. Mark Kenway continued his patrols, but the easy familiarity he once had with the park was gone, replaced by a lingering, unshakable fear. He no longer saw the basin as a predictable system of natural wonders, but as a place of impossible secrets. Sometimes on those long, quiet nights, he would stand at that same overlook and stare at the empty patch of ground, half expecting, half dreading to see the earth open up again. He never did, but he would occasionally hear a low rumble from deep underground, a vibration that no seismograph ever recorded. A sound he knew in his bones was the restless breathing of something ancient and unknowable, sleeping just beneath the thin, fragile crust of his world. The experience left a permanent scar on his psyche, a chilling reminder that the maps we draw and the rules we trust are meaningless when the ground itself decides to rewrite them. The disappearing camper. Sarah Jenkins was a seasonal worker, a college student trading a summer of fluorescent-lit lecture halls for the pine-scented air of Yellowstone's Madison campground. Her job was simple: check in campers, clean the facilities, and make sure the rules of the wilderness were respected. It was mostly routine, a predictable cycle of arrivals and departures, of campfire smoke and the quiet murmur of families enjoying the outdoors. She liked the work. It felt honest, grounded. She saw the park as a refuge, a place where people could temporarily shed the complexities of modern life. By July of 2005, she was halfway through her third season and felt she had seen it all. She had dealt with bears in coolers, tourists trying to pet bison, and every imaginable form of camping mishap. She was competent, unflappable, and believed that for every strange occurrence, there was a simple, logical explanation. The park was vast, but its operations were orderly. Then came the incident with campsite number 84. It began as a minor administrative loose end. A camper named David Paulson, a single male from Ohio, according to the registration card, was a day overdue for checkout. It wasn't uncommon. People often lost track of time, decided to stay an extra day, or simply forgot to notify the office. Sarah's manager asked her to swing by the site, leave a note, and see if the camper was still there. The morning was bright and cool, the campground stirring to life with the smell of bacon and coffee. As Sarah approached Site 84, she noticed how quiet it was. A small, high-quality dome tent, a muted forest green, was pitched perfectly in the designated area. It was a tidy site, no trash or gear strewn about. It just looked still. "Mr. Paulson?" she called out, her voice feeling unnaturally loud in the morning calm. There was no reply. She walked closer, a flicker of unease starting to build. The tent was zipped up tight, all the flaps secured against the elements. That was the first thing that struck her as odd. If he was just out for a hike, why zip the tent from the inside? The pull tab for the main zipper was clearly on the interior of the mesh door. She called his name again, louder this time, her voice tinged with an authority she didn't feel. The silence that answered was absolute. Protocol for an unresponsive camper was clear. She radioed her manager, who authorized her to enter the tent for a welfare check. With a sense of trepidation, she found a small gap in the zipper at the base and carefully worked it open. The air that escaped from the tent was stale and cold. Inside, the scene was one of frozen, interrupted domesticity. 2 sleeping bags were unrolled, one slightly rumpled as if it had been slept in, the other still perfectly smooth. A battery-powered lantern sat in the center of the tent floor, its light a pale, sickly yellow, indicating the batteries were nearly dead. It had been left on all night. A half-eaten granola bar and an open book lay beside the rumpled sleeping bag. It looked as if someone had been reading, put their book down for a moment, and intended to return immediately. But they never did. The scene felt less like an abandonment and more like a strange, silent tableau. The true weirdness, however, was what was missing. There were no boots, no jacket, no backpack. David Paulson's wallet and keys were sitting on top of his folded clothes, but the most significant missing item was his vehicle. The campground log, which Sarah double-checked, showed he had registered a silver sedan. The parking spot for Site 84 was empty. The vehicle had never been left behind. So how had he vanished from inside a zipped tent without his keys, wallet, or any outdoor gear, while his car also disappeared? A search was launched immediately. Rangers scoured the surrounding woods and the banks of the Madison River. They interviewed campers in neighboring sites. No one had seen or heard anything unusual. David Paulson had checked in 2 days prior, set up his camp quietly, and then, by all accounts, had simply ceased to exist. The investigation deepened the mystery rather than solving it. His car was found 3 days later, parked at a remote trailhead over 50 miles away, on the other side of the park. It was locked. Inside, detectives found a map with a route highlighted in yellow, leading deep into the backcountry, a route far too strenuous to be attempted without proper gear. The gear, of course, was still back at his campsite. The timeline made no sense. How could he have driven his car 50 miles away when all evidence suggested he had vanished from his tent? Had someone else driven it? If so, why? The ranger who found the car noted something peculiar in his report. The driver's seat was pushed all the way back, far further than would be comfortable for a man of Paulson's average height. Weeks turned into months. The official park campground log from July 2005 became the primary piece of evidence in a file that grew thick with speculation but thin on facts. David Paulson was added to the long, sad list of people who go missing in America's national parks each year. Most are victims of accidents, weather, or wildlife. Their stories, though tragic, have an explanation, but Paulson's story had none. It was a logical impossibility. Sarah finished her season at Madison, but the image of that silent, empty tent never left her. The low, dying light of the lantern, the half-eaten bar, the zipper closed from the inside. It became a symbol for her of the park's hidden nature. She had once seen it as a place of refuge and order, but now she understood that it was something else entirely. It was a place where the rules of reality could sometimes be suspended, where the veil between the known and the unknown was terrifyingly thin. Years later, she would read about the phenomenon of phantom campers, a recurring bit of folklore among seasonal workers. Stories of tents found empty, of sites occupied by people who were never seen, who left no trace except for a neatly made camp. She had always dismissed them as ghost stories, campfire tales. But now she knew better. She had seen the evidence firsthand. She had unzipped the tent herself and looked into a void that logic could not explain. The chilling coda to the story came from a single cryptic note found tucked into the pages of the book in Paulson's tent. It wasn't a suicide note or a letter. It was just 4 words, scribbled hastily on a torn piece of paper, as if in response to a sudden sound. The words were, "It's here. It's inside." The silent herd. Dr. Alistair Finch was a man who trusted data above all else. As a wildlife biologist for the United States Geological Survey, he saw the world in patterns, migrations, and telemetry logs. His specialty was the bison of Yellowstone, magnificent and unpredictable creatures he had studied for over a decade. He viewed them not as mythic symbols of the American West, but as complex biological systems moving across a landscape of variables. In February of 2011, he was tracking the Lamar River herd, a group of about 40 individuals fitted with state-of-the-art GPS collars. These collars were his eyes and ears, transmitting location, speed, and even biometric data directly to his research station. They allowed him to monitor the herd's health and movement without disturbing them, a clean and elegant solution for a scientist who valued non-invasive observation. The winter had been particularly harsh, with heavy snowfall and plunging temperatures, and Alistair was monitoring the herd's response to the severe conditions. For days, the data flowed in as expected. The bison moved slowly, conserving energy, foraging for buried grasses in the wide, windswept expanse of the Lamar Valley. The pings from their collars formed a predictable, slowly shifting constellation on his digital map. The anomaly began subtly, a detail that would have been missed by a less meticulous observer. At precisely 3:17 a.m., the entire herd stopped moving. All 40 GPS signals, which had been spread out over a few acres, converged into a tight, stationary cluster, and then went completely still. Alistair, checking the logs the next morning, wasn't immediately alarmed. Bison often bunched together for warmth during the coldest parts of the night. He expected the data points to start diverging again around dawn as the animals began to move, but they didn't. Hour after hour, the 40 dots on his screen remained frozen in the same location. They hadn't moved an inch. By midday, Alistair's scientific curiosity had curdled into a genuine sense of concern. 19 hours of complete stillness was not just unusual. It was biologically impossible for a herd of that size. They would have to graze, to move, to respond to the cold. He checked the diagnostic data from the collars. All systems were functioning perfectly. Batteries were charged. Transmitters were online. The collars were reporting their location with pinpoint accuracy. They were simply not moving. He made a call to the park's aviation unit, requesting an aerial survey. There was a protocol for this kind of event, often indicating a mass casualty incident like a disease outbreak or a group of bison falling through river ice. As the small reconnaissance plane took off, Alistair watched the GPS data on his monitor, a knot of anxiety tightening in his chest. The pilot's voice crackled over the radio half an hour later, laced with confusion. "Alistair, I'm over the coordinates you gave me. There's nothing here." Alistair stared at his screen. The 40 dots were still there, a solid, unmoving block of data. "That's impossible," he replied. "I'm looking right at them. You should be directly over the herd." "Negative," the pilot insisted. "The ground is covered in snow, but there's no herd, no bison, living or dead. It's just an empty field." The pilot then described a sight that made the hair on Alistair's arms stand on end. In the snow, exactly where the GPS signals were clustered, was a vast, chaotic mess of bison prints. But they weren't tracks leading somewhere. They were prints that went in tight, overlapping circles, as if the entire herd had been walking in a frantic, confused stampede within a space no larger than a basketball court. The snow was churned into a frenzy of hoof marks, and from this circle of chaos, there were no tracks leading out. It was as if 40 massive animals had simply vanished from the center of their own panic. The final, impossible piece of the puzzle came 2 days later. The GPS signals, which had remained stubbornly fixed, suddenly started moving again. But they weren't moving like animals. They were moving together at a steady 20 miles per hour, heading directly east on a Park Service road. It was the speed of a vehicle. Alistair, now working with park rangers, tracked the signal to a remote, snow-clogged turnout several miles away. There, in a neat pile half buried in a snowdrift, were the 40 GPS collars. The heavy-duty nylon straps on every single one had been sliced through with an impossible precision. The cuts were clean, almost surgical, with no signs of fraying or chewing. But the hardened steel buckles and the electronic casings were completely untouched, without a single scratch or mark on them. It was as if the straps had been severed by a blade of immense sharpness and control, a tool that could pass through the tough webbing without touching the metal it was looped through. The official USGS wildlife telemetry log for February 2011 documents the event as a mass GPS collar malfunction and subsequent loss of signal. But Alistair knew that wasn't the truth. Data doesn't lie. 40 collars don't malfunction in the exact same way at the exact same time. Herds don't vanish into thin air from the middle of a snowy field, and straps of that material don't slice themselves. He never saw any members of the Lamar River herd again. No carcasses were ever found. It was as if the animals had been erased from the ecosystem. Alistair Finch continued his work, but his faith in data as the ultimate truth was shattered. He had learned that data could show you the what, the where, and the when with perfect clarity. It could show you the impossible stillness, the frantic circles in the snow, the neatly severed collars. But it could never tell you the why. It could only present you with a perfect, terrifying record of a moment when the laws of nature were inexplicably and irrevocably broken. He was left with the chilling certainty that something else was moving through the frozen valleys of Yellowstone, something that could command a herd, erase it from existence, and leave behind nothing but a clean, cold, impossible set of data points on a screen. The Norris Basin Shift. Dr. Evan Holloway was a volcanologist, a man who spoke the language of the earth. He understood its whispers and its roars, from the slow creep of tectonic plates to the violent exhalations of a caldera. His post at the Yellowstone Volcano Observatory was the culmination of a lifelong fascination with the planet's geothermal heart. He spent his days in the Norris Geyser Basin, a landscape he considered the most honest place on Bokor, Earth. It was chaotic, dangerous, and constantly changing, a raw and visible display of the immense power simmering just beneath the surface. He monitored a network of sophisticated instruments that measured temperature, gas emissions, and ground deformation, translating the basin's volatile behavior into predictable data sets. In May of 2003, his instruments began to tell a story that made no sense. A cluster of hydrothermal vents on the far edge of the basin, an area known for its consistent, scalding steam output, suddenly went cold. Over the course of a single hour, the temperature sensors registered a precipitous drop from a steady 200 degrees Fahrenheit to just above ambient. It was a geological impossibility. Vents didn't just turn off like a switch. They might fade over decades or be choked by mineral deposits, but a sudden cessation of this magnitude was unheard of. Evan's first thought was equipment failure. He drove out to the site, his truck bouncing along the unpaved service road, his mind running through a checklist of potential malfunctions. But when he arrived, the physical evidence confirmed the data. The vents, which should have been roaring with vapor, were utterly silent. The air, usually thick with the smell of sulfur, was clean and crisp. The ground, normally too hot to touch, was cool beneath his boots. But that wasn't the most shocking part. In the moist, nutrient-rich soil around the now dormant vents, a carpet of vibrant green moss was growing. Not just a few patches, but a thick, verdant layer that covered the entire area. Moss of that type would take weeks, if not months, to establish itself. Yet it was here, thriving in a place that, just hours before, had been a sterile, superheated death zone for any form of plant life. It was as if he had stumbled into a different timeline, a future version of the basin where the fires beneath had long since died. He spent the rest of the day documenting the phenomenon, taking photographs and soil samples. His logical mind struggled to find an explanation. Perhaps a sudden blockage in the underground plumbing had diverted the heat, and the moss had been dormant, waiting for this exact opportunity. It was a weak theory, but it was the only one he had. He left the site at dusk, a profound sense of unease settling over him. The basin felt wrong, its silence more threatening than its usual roar. The next 48 hours only deepened the mystery. The instruments remained silent, the temperatures low. Evan's photographs, showing the impossible greenery, were viewed with fascination and disbelief by his colleagues at the observatory. They planned a full-scale geological survey for the following day, but they never got the chance. On the morning of the third day, the alarms at the observatory blared to life. The sensors at the dormant vent site had reactivated, but they weren't just back to normal. They were registering temperatures far exceeding anything ever recorded in that location. The ground was deforming rapidly, swelling upwards. Evan raced back to the site, his heart pounding with a mixture of fear and scientific excitement. He arrived to a scene of primeval fury. The vents were erupting with a violence he had never witnessed, spewing columns of black, superheated steam hundreds of feet into the air. The ground shook with a continuous deep tremor, and the moss, the vibrant green carpet of life that had so inexplicably appeared, was gone. It had been completely obliterated, scalded from the earth, leaving behind only scorched, blackened soil. The vent system had not just turned back on, it had returned with a vengeance, as if to aggressively erase any evidence of its temporary slumber. The observatory's official note from May 2003 classified the event as a temporary hydrothermal occlusion, followed by a violent phreatic eruption. It was a neat, clinical explanation that accounted for the pressure buildup and release. But it didn't account for the moss. It couldn't explain how a complex ecosystem had appeared and established itself in a matter of hours, only to be annihilated just as quickly. Evan's photographs were the only proof that it had ever existed. They became a source of private obsession for him, a collection of impossible images that defied the laws of biology and geology he had built his career on. He would look at them for hours, at the impossible green against the backdrop of the desolate basin. He began to think of the event not in scientific terms, but in more ancient, mythological ones. It was as if the earth itself had taken a single, slow breath. The cold silence and the sudden life of the moss were the inhalation, a brief, deceptive moment of peace. The violent, cleansing eruption was the exhalation, a furious assertion of its true nature. Evan Holloway never looked at the Norris Basin the same way again. He had always seen it as a complex machine, but now he saw it as a living entity, a slumbering behemoth whose motives were ancient and utterly alien. He had been a privileged witness to one of its dreams, a fleeting vision of a cool green world, before the creature stirred, opened its fiery eyes, and burned the dream away. The photographs on his desk served as a constant, chilling reminder that the ground he walked on was not solid and dependable, but merely the thin, fragile skin of something vast, powerful, and incomprehensibly alive. The lodge lights. The Old Faithful Inn was more than just a hotel. It was a living monument, a sprawling log and stone leviathan that had watched over the Upper Geyser Basin for nearly a century. Its gnarled balconies and cavernous lobby echoed with the footsteps of generations. For most, it was a place of wonder and history. For Arthur Penn, it was just his job. As a night janitor, Arthur's world was the inn after hours, a realm of hushed quiet and long, empty hallways. He knew the building's secrets, the floorboards that groaned like a dying man, the drafts that whispered through the window frames, the way the whole structure seemed to sigh as it settled in the cold. In November of 1999, during the lonely shoulder season when the inn was mostly empty, Arthur's quiet routine was disrupted by something that defied the building's familiar quirks. He was working on the ground floor, mopping the massive stone hearth, when he noticed a flicker of light from above. He looked up towards the grand staircase and saw it. Lights were on in the east wing of the third floor. This was impossible. The entire wing was closed for the winter, sealed off for renovations. Arthur himself had helped the maintenance crew shut down the power to that section weeks ago. He had personally flipped the breakers in the basement panel, taping them in the off position. He walked to the panel, his heavy boots echoing in the silent building. The breakers for the third-floor east wing were exactly as he'd left them, off, with the yellow caution tape still securely in place. Yet, when he returned to the lobby, the lights were still on, casting a weak, wavering glow from the distant windows. They weren't burning steadily. They were flickering, pulsing with a slow, organic rhythm, like a failing heart. A cold unease crept up his spine. Arthur was a practical man, not given to superstition. He assumed there was a fault in the wiring, some kind of residual charge or a short circuit bypassing the breaker. He made a note on his clipboard for the day crew and tried to put it out of his mind. But the next night, the phenomenon escalated. A handful of guests staying in the second-floor rooms directly below the closed-off wing began to complain. They reported hearing footsteps, a heavy, measured pacing, coming from the empty rooms above them. One guest, a woman traveling alone, called the front desk in a panic, claiming she could hear furniture being dragged across the floor. Arthur was sent to reassure her. He explained that the floor above was unoccupied, that it was probably just the old building settling. But as he stood in the hallway outside her room, he heard it too. A distinct, rhythmic thudding from the ceiling. Thud. Pause. Thud. It sounded like someone walking with a limp, dragging one foot heavily behind them. He felt the blood drain from his face. The building was old, but it wasn't that old. These were not the familiar creaks and groans he knew so well. This was something else. This was the sound of presence. The Xanterra facility's work order from that week became a document of mounting strangeness. Arthur's initial report of flickering lights was followed by multiple entries logging guest complaints about noise from the sealed-off wing. The maintenance logs were clear. No staff had been scheduled to work in that section. The doors were locked. The power was off. Yet the activity continued. On the third night, Arthur decided to investigate himself. Armed with a heavy maglite, flashlight, he used his master key to unlock the barricaded door to the east wing. The air that hit him was stale and colder than the rest of the hotel, carrying the scent of sawdust and old linen. He stepped inside, his flashlight beam cutting a nervous path through the darkness. The hallway was a skeleton of its future self, with plastic sheeting covering furniture and tools left in tidy piles by the renovation crew. He walked towards the rooms where the lights had been seen, his footsteps echoing his own heartbeat. He found the first room, its door slightly ajar. Pushing it open, he swept his light across the space. It was empty, a chaotic mess of construction materials. But in the center of the room, in the thick layer of dust on the floor, were tracks. They were not the cleated prints of work boots. They were smooth, shuffling marks, as if someone had been dragging their feet in slow, circular patterns. And leading away from the circles, towards the window overlooking the geyser basin, was a single, clear set of footprints. They were barefoot. Arthur backed out of the room slowly, his throat tight with fear. He didn't check the other rooms. He didn't need to. He locked the wing, went straight to the security office, and refused to work on that side of the building again. He told his supervisor he was sick, that he was imagining things. It was easier than trying to explain the barefoot prints in the dust on a sealed floor, 3 stories up, in the dead of a Yellowstone winter. The strange activity ceased a few days later as abruptly as it had begun. The lights went out. The footsteps fell silent. The renovation crew returned and found nothing amiss, except for the strangely disturbed dust in one of the rooms, which they swept away without a second thought. Arthur Penn never talked much about what he saw and heard during those November nights, but the experience changed his relationship with the inn. He no longer saw it as a collection of logs and stone, but as a vessel, a container for the memories and emotions of all the people who had passed through its doors. He came to believe that some guests, the ones with the heaviest burdens, had never truly checked out. They were still there, pacing the empty hallways of the old hotel, their phantom footsteps a permanent echo in the heart of the building, waiting for the quiet season to walk again. The vanishing pool. Leo was a photographer, a chaser of light. He specialized in capturing the sublime landscapes of the American West at the golden hour, that fleeting moment at sunrise when the world is painted in hues of impossible beauty. In September of 2012, he was in Yellowstone, on a personal mission to document the park's thermal pools. He wasn't interested in the famous, boardwalk-lined attractions. He was seeking the hidden gems, the unmarked, unnamed pools that required backcountry permits and hours of hiking to find. He believed these remote places held a purer, more elemental magic. He began his hike one morning, long before dawn, navigating by headlamp through a dense lodgepole pine forest. His destination was a remote, unnamed meadow that his research suggested might contain some interesting geothermal activity. As the first hints of dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, he emerged from the trees into the meadow. The scene that greeted him took his breath away. There, in the center of the frost-covered grass, was a thermal pool he had never seen on any map or in any guidebook. It was a perfect circle, perhaps 30 feet in diameter, and the water was a shade of turquoise so vibrant it seemed to glow from within. A gentle plume of steam rose from its surface, catching the first rays of the sun and turning them into a shimmering, ethereal veil. It was, without a doubt, the most beautiful and pristine hot spring he had ever seen. He worked quickly, his hands numb with cold, setting up his tripod and camera. He knew this light was temporary, a gift that would soon be gone. For the next hour, he was lost in his work, capturing the pool from every conceivable angle as the sun rose higher, changing the colors of the water and steam with every passing minute. The pool was utterly silent, no bubbling or gurgling, just a serene, glassy surface that perfectly reflected the deep blue of the morning sky. The only sound was the click of his camera's shutter. As the light became harsher, he packed up his gear, a sense of elation filling him. He had found it. He had captured a piece of the park's hidden soul. Knowing that such a significant, unmapped feature should be reported, he made a careful note of his GPS coordinates and hiked back to his car, his mind already processing the stunning images he had taken. That afternoon, he went to the park's geology office, his camera in hand. He showed his photographs to a grizzled veteran ranger named Sullivan. The ranger studied the images with a frown. "I've worked this park for 30 years, Sullivan said, tracing the landscape in the background of one of the photos. "I know this meadow. There's no thermal feature of that size there. Never has been." Leo, though surprised by the ranger's certainty, insisted. "I was there this morning. I have the GPS coordinates." Sullivan, intrigued and professionally obligated, agreed to go with him. They drove to the trailhead and made the hike back to the meadow, arriving in the full, flat light of the afternoon. As they stepped out of the forest, Leo stopped dead in his tracks, a wave of cold disbelief washing over him. The pool was gone. The meadow was just a meadow, an expanse of dry, undisturbed grass. There was no depression in the ground, no steam, no hint of moisture. It was as if the pool had never existed. I don't understand, Leo stammered, walking out to the spot where he had set up his tripod just hours earlier. It was right here. It was real. Sullivan walked the area slowly, his eyes scanning the ground. He knelt down, running his hand through the grass. No scorch marks, no mineral deposits, he said, looking up at Leo. If a pool of that size was here this morning, the ground would be soaked. The vegetation would be dead for yards around. This grass hasn't been disturbed in weeks. Leo felt a frantic, desperate need to prove he wasn't crazy. He pulled out his camera and showed the ranger the digital files, the time-stamped images of the glowing turquoise water. Sullivan stared at the pictures, then back at the empty meadow, his expression a mixture of bewilderment and concern. "The photos are real," Leo said, his voice pleading. "I took them right here, this morning." The ranger had no explanation. The visitor-submitted photos were logged, along with a report detailing the fruitless search. The official explanation, whispered among the staff, was that Leo had stumbled upon a brand new thermal feature, a breather vent that had opened and closed in the span of a few hours. It was a rare but not impossible phenomenon. But Leo knew that wasn't the whole truth. A temporary vent would have left a scar, a wound on the earth. The meadow he had returned to was not wounded. It was pristine, as if it were hiding a secret. The experience haunted him. He had the photographs, irrefutable proof of a place that did not exist. They were beautiful, but looking at them now filled him with a deep, primordial fear. He had not just photographed a landscape, he had witnessed a geological apparition, a temporary mirage of impossible beauty. He began to wonder about the nature of the park itself. Maybe it wasn't a static, solid place, but something fluid and dreamlike. Maybe it had the power to reveal things, to show you a hidden, perfect world for a few brief hours, only to pull it back into the earth, leaving you with nothing but a memory and a photograph that no one would ever truly believe. The vanishing pool taught Leo a humbling lesson, that some things are not meant to be mapped or documented, only witnessed. They are fleeting glimpses into a reality that operates on a timescale and by a set of rules far older and stranger than our own. The Canyon Echo, the Grand Canyon of the Yellowstone, is a place of overwhelming scale and sound. The roar of the lower falls is a constant elemental presence, a sound that you feel in your bones as much as you hear with your ears. For park volunteer Thomas Albright, a retired history teacher spending his summer as a guide, that roar was the backdrop to his daily life. He stood at Artist Point, one of the most famous overlooks, and shared stories of the canyon's history with throngs of tourists, his voice practiced at cutting through the noise of the waterfall and the wind. In July of 1984, during a particularly busy and hot afternoon, the familiar sounds of the canyon were pierced by something unsettling. Thomas was in the middle of a talk when a tourist, a woman from Germany, interrupted him, her face pale with concern. "Excuse me," she said, her English accented. "Do you hear that? The people yelling?" Thomas paused, listening. Over the thunder of the falls, he could hear nothing unusual. "I'm sorry, ma'am," he said. "I think you're just hearing the waterfall. The acoustics here can play tricks on you." But then another visitor, a young man with a backpack, spoke up. "No, she's right. I hear it too. It sounds like shouting, like someone's in trouble down there." A small crowd began to murmur, their faces turning from the majestic view to peer anxiously into the 1,000-foot abyss. Thomas listened again, this time concentrating, filtering out the low-frequency rumble of the water. And then he heard it, faint, distorted, but undeniably present. It was the sound of human voices, multiple voices, rising in what sounded like panicked calls for help. The sounds were woven into the fabric of the waterfall's roar, like threads of human desperation in a tapestry of natural power. His training kicked in immediately. He used his radio to call the ranger station, reporting a possible emergency at the canyon base below Artist Point. The response was swift. A search and rescue team was assembled, a difficult and dangerous operation that involved rappelling down the treacherous, near-vertical canyon walls. Thomas remained at the overlook, managing the concerned crowd, his own gaze fixed on the canyon floor. From his vantage point, he could see the area directly below. It was a desolate landscape of jagged rock and churning white water. There was nowhere to hide, nowhere a person could be without being easily visible. The search team spent 4 hours scouring the base of the falls. They found nothing. No footprints, no discarded gear, no sign that anyone had been there at all. The official report concluded that the incident was a case of auditory pareidolia, a psychological phenomenon where the brain interprets random noise as a familiar pattern, in this case, human speech. The canyon's complex acoustics were known to create such illusions. The incident was logged and largely forgotten by the Park Service, but not by Thomas. He had heard the voices. They were too distinct, too filled with terror to be a trick of the mind. He started paying closer attention, listening not just as a guide, but as a witness. He discovered that the phenomenon was not a one-time event. On certain days, when the wind was just right, the phantom echoes would return. He learned to distinguish them from the roar of the water, to pick out the faint, ghostly syllables that rose from the depths. He began to keep a private log, documenting each time he heard them. Other visitors would hear them too, their faces turning from awe to alarm as they caught the phantom cries for help. He would offer the official explanation about acoustics, but his words felt hollow, a lie told to maintain a sense of order in a place that seemed to defy it. Driven by a need for proof, Thomas purchased a high-quality audio recorder. He would leave it running for hours near the canyon rim, hoping to capture the sounds. Most of the tapes contained nothing but the overwhelming noise of the falls. But one evening, as he played back a recording, he heard them. The filtering and amplification of the recording equipment had isolated the voices from the background noise. They were still distorted, but they were clearer than he had ever heard them with his own ears. He could make out what sounded like overlapping phrases. "Help me," and "down here," and a long, drawn-out cry that chilled him to the bone. It wasn't just a random assortment of syllables. It was the language of emergency. The Ranger incident log from July 1984 was the official story, but Thomas's tapes told a different one. They suggested that the canyon was more than just a geological formation. It was a repository of echoes, a place that had somehow recorded and was now replaying a moment of past tragedy. He researched the park's history, looking for records of a mass casualty event at the base of the falls, a group of climbers or hikers who had met their end there. He found nothing. There was no historical event to match the sounds he was hearing. The mystery deepened, becoming more terrifying. If these were not the echoes of a past event, then what were they? Were they a warning? Or were they something else? A lure? A siren song emanating from the heart of the canyon, calling the living down into its depths. Thomas Albright finished his summer at Yellowstone, but the canyon's phantom voices followed him home. He could never again hear the sound of rushing water without his mind straining to hear the faint, desperate cries hidden within it. He was left with the horrifying realization that some places are not just silent witnesses to history, they are active participants holding on to moments of terror and replaying them for anyone who has the misfortune to listen closely enough. The canyon was not just echoing sound, it was echoing fear itself. The sulfur hut, the air around the mud volcano area, always tasted of metal and brimstone, a constant reminder of the volatile chemical processes unfolding just beneath the thin crust of the earth. For Dr. Ian Cresswell, a seasonal researcher with the Environmental Protection Agency, this was the smell of discovery. His job in the summer of 2006 was to catalog geothermal gas emissions, specifically the fluctuating levels of sulfur dioxide, a key indicator of magmatic activity. His work took him to remote, often hazardous locations, small monitoring huts scattered throughout the park's most active thermal areas. One such structure was the Sulfur Hut, a small, forgotten cabin tucked away in a particularly pungent and unstable region north of the main tourist path. It hadn't been actively used in years, but some of its old monitoring equipment was still running on solar power, transmitting data to a central archive. It was a ghost station on the park's scientific map. One afternoon, while reviewing archived data, Ian noticed a startling anomaly. The sensors at the Sulfur Hut, which had been dormant for years, had suddenly sprung to life. They were reporting sulfur dioxide concentrations that were off the charts, levels so high they would be lethal to anyone exposed for more than a few minutes. The readings were so extreme that Ian's first assumption was a catastrophic equipment malfunction. Curious, he decided to hike out to the hut to investigate. It was not an easy trek. The area was a maze of bubbling mud pots and acidic hot springs, the ground soft and unreliable underfoot. The smell of sulfur grew stronger with every step, a suffocating, rotten egg stench that burned his nostrils. When he finally saw the hut, a small, weathered wooden box perched on the edge of a steaming fumarole, he knew immediately that this was no malfunction. The exterior of the cabin was stained a sickly, brilliant yellow, a chemical deposit left by the intense gas emissions. The air around it shimmered with heat and toxic vapor. He put on his emergency respirator before approaching, his heart pounding with a mix of scientific curiosity and primal fear. The door was unlocked. He pushed it open and was met with a wave of heat and a smell so overpowering it made his eyes water, even through the mask. The interior of the one-room hut was a scene of scientific abandonment. Old equipment, a mix of analog and early digital technology, was scattered across a workbench. Charts were pinned to the wall, their paper yellowed and brittle. But what was most unsettling was the evidence of recent activity. A modern laptop sat open on the desk, its screen glowing faintly. A thermos of coffee was next to it, still warm to the touch. And the monitoring equipment, the source of the anomalous readings, was actively running, its fans whirring, its lights blinking. Someone had been here, very recently. On the desk, next to the laptop, was a field logbook. Ian picked it up, his gloved hands trembling slightly. It detailed the work of a researcher he had never heard of, a Dr. Al-Jamil, who seemed to be conducting an independent study on extremophile bacteria. The entries were meticulous, detailing a growing excitement about a unique microbial strain discovered in the nearby vents. But the final entry stopped abruptly, mid-sentence. It read, "The samples are showing a metabolic rate that defies biological explanation. The organism is not just surviving in this environment, it is..." The sentence was never finished. The pen lay next to the logbook, as if it had been dropped in a sudden hurry. Ian backed out of the hut, a cold dread seeping into his bones. The place felt like a tomb. He radioed his findings to park headquarters, and the mystery only deepened. There was no record of a Dr. Al-Jamil ever being issued a research permit. No one by that name had checked into the park. He had no official existence. Yet, he had been in that hut, running sophisticated equipment, a ghost in the scientific machine. An investigation was launched, but it yielded no answers. The laptop was encrypted beyond the Park Service's ability to crack. The name Al-Jamil led to a series of dead ends. The researcher, whoever he was, had vanished without a trace, leaving behind only his unfinished work and a cabin saturated with a lethal concentration of gas. The EPA field record from August 2006 officially documents the discovery of an unauthorized and abandoned research site. The hut was eventually decommissioned and dismantled, its toxic legacy deemed too dangerous to leave standing. But for Ian Cresswell, the story was far from over. He became obsessed with the logbook's final, unfinished sentence. What was the organism doing? What discovery had been so momentous, so terrifying, that it had caused a meticulous scientist to drop his pen and flee? Or worse? He began to theorize, to imagine a form of life that didn't just tolerate the sulfur, but thrived on it, that consumed it, that was perhaps composed of it. He pictured the walls of the hut, stained yellow not just by chemical deposits, but by the gradual colonization of this unknown life form. Was it possible that the researcher hadn't been driven out by the gas, but by the thing that lived in the gas? The sulfur hut became a symbol for him of the terrifying possibilities that lie at the edges of our understanding. He had stumbled upon the remnants of a secret, a discovery that someone had tried to make in the shadows. The chilling coda was the realization that the secret was still out there, in the bubbling, steaming landscape of Yellowstone. A form of life that shouldn't exist, a researcher who never was, and a final, unfinished sentence hanging in the toxic air like a permanent, unanswered question. The Night Hiker. The Lamar Valley in October is a place of stark, elemental beauty. The summer crowds have thinned, the aspens have shed their golden leaves, and a profound silence settles over the landscape. For Benjamin Crane, a retired teacher and avid amateur astronomer, it was the perfect setting for a solo camping trip. He came for the clear, dark skies, a celestial panorama unsullied by the light pollution of the city he had left behind. He was a man of quiet habits and rational thought, someone who found comfort in the predictable movements of the cosmos. On his third night, a night with a brilliant full moon that illuminated the valley floor in a ghostly silver light, his orderly world was fractured by something that did not belong. It was 3 a.m, and he was outside his tent, observing a meteor shower through his portable telescope. The air was frigid, the silence absolute except for the distant howl of a coyote. He scanned the landscape, admiring the way the moonlight cast long, sharp shadows from the sagebrush. That's when he saw the figure. It was far out in the open meadow, perhaps half a mile away. It was unmistakably human in shape, a tall, slender silhouette moving against the pale, frost-covered grass. It was walking with a steady, unhurried pace, heading from west to east across the vast, empty expanse. Benjamin's first reaction was a mix of surprise and concern. A hiker out at this hour, in this cold, was highly unusual and potentially dangerous. He watched the figure through his binoculars, expecting it to stop, to look around, to show some sign of being a lost or disoriented person. But it did neither. It simply walked, its pace never faltering. For 20 minutes, Benjamin tracked the figure's progress. It moved with an eerie, metronomic consistency, a fluid, unbroken stride that seemed unnatural. It never stumbled, never paused, never deviated from its straight-line path. It was as if it were gliding over the uneven terrain rather than walking on it. A deep sense of wrongness began to creep over him. There were no trails out there. The ground was rough, riddled with animal burrows and clumps of tough vegetation. No human could maintain such a perfect, effortless pace across that kind of landscape, especially not in the dark. He felt a primal fear, the kind that whispers that you are seeing something you are not supposed to see. Using his small handheld radio, he contacted the ranger station, his voice a low, urgent whisper. He reported what he was seeing, a possible night hiker in distress. The dispatcher, a calm, professional voice in the darkness, took his report, promised to send a ranger to investigate at first light, and advised him to stay in his tent. Benjamin did as he was told, but he didn't sleep. He sat in the dark, listening. The image of the silent, walking figure burned into his mind. At dawn, a young ranger arrived at his campsite. Benjamin recounted his story, pointing out the path the figure had taken across the meadow. The ranger was patient but skeptical, explaining the common tricks that moonlight and ground frost can play on the eyes, how they can distort scale and create illusions of movement. Together, they walked out into the meadow, the morning sun glinting off the thick layer of hoar frost that coated every blade of grass. They walked the entire route Benjamin had described, a straight line more than a mile long. They found nothing. There were no tracks, not a single footprint. The delicate, crystalline structure of the frost was completely untouched, a perfect, unbroken sheet of white. If someone had walked there just a few hours earlier, their boots would have left a clear, dark trail, but there was no trail. "Are you sure about what you saw?" the ranger asked gently. Benjamin could only nod, his throat too tight to speak. He knew what he had seen. The figure was real. Its 20-minute journey across his field of vision was a memory as solid and certain as the cold in his bones. But the evidence of the frost was equally certain. The two realities could not coexist, yet they did. The ranger communication log from that night in October 1992 records a report of a possible night hiker concluded to be a nocturnal illusion. It was a simple, rational explanation for an event that felt anything but. Benjamin Crane packed up his campsite that morning and left the Lamar Valley 2 days ahead of schedule. He never went back. The experience had fundamentally altered his perception of the world. He had spent his life looking up at the predictable, orderly heavens, but a single, silent figure walking across a moonlit field had shown him that the real, terrifying mysteries were right here on Earth. He was haunted by the effortless grace of the figure's movement, its complete indifference to the difficult terrain. It hadn't been walking on the ground. It had been moving over it. The chilling question that stayed with him for the rest of his life was not what he had seen, but what the figure was doing. Where was it going with such relentless, unwavering purpose in the dead of night? And what would have happened if it had turned, if it had seen him, a lone observer with a telescope, watching from the edge of the darkness? He had witnessed a traveler on a journey he could not comprehend, a silent pilgrim on a road that left no marks, and the memory of its passage was a cold, permanent presence in his soul. The Hot Spring Shoes Miguel was part of a maintenance crew, one of the unsung workers who kept Yellowstone's infrastructure from being reclaimed by the wilderness. His job was a constant battle against the elements, repairing boardwalks warped by geothermal heat, clearing trails blocked by fallen trees, and replacing signs faded by the brutal sun and winter snow. In June of 2017, he was assigned to a routine task in the Upper Geyser Basin, replacing a section of boardwalk that had been damaged by mineral deposits from a nearby hot spring. It was a hot, tedious job, the air thick with the smell of sulfur and the hiss of steam. As he worked, prying up the old, splintered planks, something caught his eye. Just off the boardwalk, at the edge of a boiling sapphire blue pool, was a pair of shoes. They were modern running shoes, a popular brand, and they looked brand new. But they weren't just sitting there. They were fused to the ground, melted into the delicate, layered cinder crust that forms around the edges of hot springs. The rubber soles had softened in the intense heat and then re-hardened, becoming one with the white, rocky earth. Miguel stared at the shoes, a cold knot forming in his stomach despite the sweltering heat. The scene was deeply, fundamentally wrong. This was a high-traffic area. Hundreds of tourists walked this path every day. How could a pristine pair of shoes be left here, melted into the very ground, without anyone noticing? He immediately called his supervisor, who in turn called park security. The area was cordoned off, and a grim search began. The ranger's first assumption was the most tragic and common one. A visitor had slipped off the boardwalk and fallen into the superheated, acidic water. In such cases, there is often very little left to find. The pool was probed, the surrounding area meticulously searched, but the search yielded nothing. No remains, no scraps of clothing, no personal belongings, just the shoes. The investigation turned to the park's visitor logs and missing person reports. They searched for anyone who had been reported missing in the park around that time. They found no one. They cross-referenced vehicle logs from the entrance gates, looking for a car that had entered but never left. Again, nothing. It was as if the owner of the shoes had never existed in the first place. The shoes themselves only deepened the mystery. When they were carefully chiseled out of the cinder, forensic analysis revealed two strange facts. First, there was no biological material inside them. No traces of skin, socks, or even sweat. They were completely, sterilely empty. Second, the wear pattern on the soles was non-existent. They were brand new, unworn. Someone had apparently placed a pair of unworn shoes at the edge of a boiling pool and left them there to be consumed by the earth. The park safety report from June 2017 documents the finding, concluding with the unsatisfactory note: origin of footwear undetermined. No associated missing person. Case closed. For the park officials, it was a bizarre but ultimately minor incident, an inexplicable piece of litter. For Miguel, it was the stuff of nightmares. He couldn't shake the image of those empty shoes, their bright synthetic colors, a stark violation against the natural landscape. They were a statement, a deliberate and unsettling piece of theater. He would lie awake at night, his mind replaying the scene. He imagined someone calmly walking to the edge of the boiling water, carefully placing the new shoes on the hot crust, and then, what? Turning around and walking away barefoot? Or simply ceasing to be? The lack of wear on the shoes was what haunted him the most. They were not the shoes of a hiker or a tourist. They were an offering, a sacrifice. But to what? He began to see the geyser basin differently. It was no longer just a collection of geological wonders. It was a place of power, a thin spot in the world where the veil between the rational and the irrational was permeable. He started to believe that the basin demanded things, that it had an ancient, unspoken hunger. The shoes were not evidence of an accident, but of a transaction. Someone had given something to the pool, and the pool had accepted it. Miguel continued his work, repairing the boardwalks that kept people safe from the very real dangers of the park. But he now understood that the greatest dangers were not the ones you could see. They were not the boiling water or the unstable ground. The greatest danger was the chilling possibility that there were forces at play in that ancient landscape that operated by a logic so alien it could only be glimpsed in the form of a strange, inexplicable offering, like a pair of new shoes, empty and waiting, slowly being swallowed by the earth. The lake-static Yellowstone Lake is a vast, high-altitude body of water, a cold, deep heart in the center of the park. Its beauty is deceptive. Beneath its placid blue surface, the lake floor is a landscape of geothermal vents, submerged canyons, and volcanic domes. For amateur angler and radio enthusiast Frank Miller, the lake was a place of profound peace and solitude. In August of 1989, he was on a multi-day fishing trip, his small boat a solitary speck on the immense expanse of water. He was not just an angler, he was a student of the lake's moods, its sudden storms, and its deep, quiet places. One afternoon, he was drifting over the West Thumb Basin, one of the deepest parts of the lake, known for its submerged geothermal activity. The fishing was slow, and he was passing the time scanning the frequencies on his handheld VHF radio. He was listening to the clipped professional chatter of the park rangers when his radio suddenly erupted in a deafening blast of white noise. It wasn't the usual crackle of a weak signal. It was a loud, aggressive static that completely overwhelmed the channel. Frank, an experienced radio operator, assumed he was passing over a magnetic anomaly on the lake floor. He checked his position on his map. He was directly over the deepest part of the basin. He found it curious, but not alarming. He was about to change the channel when he noticed something within the wall of static. It was a sound, faint and rhythmic, buried deep within the noise. He turned the volume up, pressing the radio speaker to his ear. The sound was voices, not one voice, but many, all speaking at once, their words overlapping and distorted into a strange, unintelligible chorus. It sounded like a crowded room, a cacophony of conversations, but they were all warped, as if being played back through water. He couldn't make out a single word, but the cadence was unmistakably human. A shiver traced its way down his spine. He was in the middle of a massive lake, miles from any significant human settlement. There was no logical source for such a broadcast. He tried other channels, but the result was the same. As long as his boat was in that specific area, every frequency was consumed by the static and the phantom voices hidden within it. Intrigued and deeply unsettled, he decided to conduct an experiment. He had a small cassette recorder with him. He held it up to the radio speaker and recorded the sound for several minutes. Then, he lifted his anchor and let the boat drift a few hundred feet away from the spot. The moment he cleared the area, the static vanished. The radio returned to its normal, clear reception. He could hear the rangers again, their voices crisp and distinct. He rowed back to the original spot. As soon as he crossed some invisible line on the water, the static roared back to life, the chorus of drowned voices returning with it. It was a localized phenomenon, a pocket of auditory strangeness in the middle of the lake. He spent the rest of the afternoon drifting in and out of the zone, a scientist in a rowboat mapping the boundaries of the impossible. The effect was consistent, repeatable, and utterly terrifying. That night, back at his campsite, he played the recording. Listening to it in the quiet of the forest was even more disturbing. Without the context of the open water and the daylight, the sounds on the tape were purely menacing. The overlapping voices seemed to rise and fall in panicked waves. He thought he could almost make out words now, fragments of sentences that surfaced from the noise for a moment before being submerged again. Words like cold, down, and water. The angler-submitted VHF recording became a minor curiosity in the park's archives, filed away with other reports of strange radio interference. The official explanation was simple. The deep, geothermally active basin was known to interfere with radio waves, creating cross-channel echoes and phantom signals. But Frank Miller knew what he had heard was not just interference. It was too complex, too structured. The voices were not random noise. They were a message, trapped in a loop, broadcasting from the depths. He began to research the history of the lake, looking for stories of boating accidents, of people lost to its cold, deep waters. He found several, tragedies stretching back over a century. He started to wonder if the lake was more than just water. Was it a recording medium? Had the unique combination of cold water, geothermal energy, and mineral content somehow captured the final, desperate moments of those who had drowned there? Was he listening to a chorus of ghosts, their last words trapped in an endless electronic echo chamber at the bottom of the lake? Frank never went fishing in the West Thumb Basin again. The knowledge of what lay beneath the surface, not physically but audibly, had tainted the lake's beauty for him forever. He couldn't look at its calm, reflective surface without imagining the cacophony of voices trapped beneath it, a permanent broadcast of fear and confusion, waiting for someone to drift into the right spot and tune their radio to the frequency of the dead. The mudpot footprints Dr. Eris Thorne was a park geologist, a man who read the history of the earth in layers of rock and shifts in the landscape. He was methodical, patient, and deeply familiar with the volatile personality of Yellowstone's thermal areas. The mud volcano region, with its acidic, boiling mud pots and the constant guttural belching of the Dragon's Mouth Spring, was a place he treated with immense respect. The ground here was a thin, fragile skin over a cauldron of superheated water and gas. A single misstep could be your last. In April of 2001, during a routine survey after the spring thaw, Harris noticed something that made him freeze in his tracks. On a stretch of thin, barely stable crust near the edge of a large, bubbling mud pot was a set of footprints. They were fresh, clearly defined in the damp, gray earth. And they were barefoot. Aris stared at the prints, his mind struggling to process the sheer recklessness of what he was seeing. To walk barefoot in this area was not just foolish, it was suicidal. The ground temperature alone could cause severe burns, and the crust could give way at any moment, plunging a person into the boiling, acidic mud below. He immediately got on his radio, reporting a possible medical emergency and a likely fatality. He assumed he would be looking for a body. He began to follow the tracks, his own booted feet staying on the reinforced, safer ground. The prints were small, perhaps belonging to a woman or a teenager. They formed a clear, deliberate path, leading away from the designated trail and heading directly towards some of the most dangerous and unstable thermal features in the area. The path the prints took was what truly disturbed him. They didn't meander or show any signs of hesitation or panic. They moved in a straight, purposeful line, as if the person who made them knew exactly where they were going. and had no fear of the treacherous ground. The footprints continued for about 30 yards, and then they stopped. They didn't lead to the edge of a pool, nor were there signs of a struggle or a fall. The prints simply ceased to exist in the middle of an open, unbroken patch of drying mud. One moment they were there, a clear sequence of left and right feet, and the next, there was nothing but smooth, undisturbed earth. Aris scanned the entire area, his eyes searching for any clue, any explanation. Had the person been lifted into the air? Had they simply vanished? The logical part of his brain fought for an answer. Perhaps the ground had been wetter where the prints stopped, and the subsequent steps had just not registered. But the consistency of the mud didn't support that theory. It was all the same. A search was quickly organized. Rangers combed the area, helicopters flew overhead. They found no one. No one was reported missing that day. No vehicle was left abandoned in the parking lots. The person who made the footprints seemed to have no connection to the outside world. They had walked out of nowhere, left a short, impossible trail, and then disappeared back into it. The NPS Geology Survey log for that day documents the unidentified barefoot tracks and the subsequent unsuccessful search. The incident was filed away as an unsolved mystery, likely the work of a reckless individual who had managed to leave the area undetected. But Aris Thorne couldn't accept such a simple explanation. The image of the footprints, so clear and so deliberate, was burned into his memory. They were not the tracks of a lost tourist. They were the tracks of something that understood this landscape in a way no human could. Something that could walk on ground that should have burned it, and that could vanish without a trace. He began to look into the folklore of the area, the old stories told by the native tribes who had lived on this land for centuries. He found tales of spirits, of beings who were born from the steam and the mud, who could walk through the hottest springs unharmed. They were said to be guardians of the geothermal areas, and their appearance was often a sign of the land's displeasure. He had always dismissed these stories as primitive mythology, but now he wasn't so sure. What he had seen defied geological and physical laws. Perhaps mythology was simply another way of explaining the impossible. Aris continued his work as a geologist, but a new, unsettling layer of understanding had been added to his scientific knowledge. He now saw the thermal areas not just as geological phenomena, but as living places with their own rules and their own inhabitants. He would often return to the spot where he had seen the prints. The ground had long since hardened and shifted, erasing all evidence. But in his mind, he could still see them perfectly. A short, straight path of impossible defiance, leading from the world of the known directly into the heart of an ancient, terrifying mystery. The barefoot prints were a message, a quiet and chilling statement that we are not the only ones who walk upon this earth. The Phantom Tour Bus, the west entrance to Yellowstone, is a constant river of steel and glass, a bottleneck through which thousands of vehicles pour into the park each day during the peak summer season. For Ranger Eileen Connolly, working the entrance station in July of 2015 was a blur of friendly greetings, map distribution, and fee collection. Her world was governed by numbers and logistics, vehicle counts, traffic flow, and campsite availability. Part of her job involved monitoring the automated traffic counting system, a network of magnetic sensors embedded in the asphalt, and surveillance cameras that logged every vehicle that passed. The system was reliable, a crucial tool for managing the park's immense popularity. One evening, as the sun was setting and the flow of traffic had slowed to a trickle, the system logged something strange. Eileen was reconciling the day's manual count with the automated data when she saw the discrepancy. The automated system had recorded one more charter bus than the gate attendants had manually checked in. According to the system's log, a large charter-style bus had passed through the entrance at 7:52 p.m., just as dusk was settling. Eileen frowned. She had been on duty at that time. She remembered the last few cars of the day: a family in an RV, a couple on motorcycles. She had no memory of a bus. She pulled up the surveillance footage from the camera aimed at the entrance lane. The time-stamped video showed exactly what she remembered. The RV, the motorcycles, a few other passenger cars. There was no bus, yet the magnetic sensor had triggered, and the system had logged it as a large-profile vehicle. She chalked it up to a sensor glitch, a common occurrence. Large trucks or RVs towing trailers sometimes confused the system, creating a phantom vehicle in the data. She made a note in the maintenance log and prepared to close the station for the night. But a nagging sense of curiosity made her check the park's internal lodging and tour group records. If a charter bus had entered, it had to be going somewhere. It would be registered with one of the park's hotels or a designated tour operator. She ran a search. No bus company had a tour scheduled to arrive that late. None of the lodges, not Old Faithful, not Grant Village, not Canyon, had a charter bus check-in for that evening. The bus, if it existed, had no official destination within the park. This elevated the incident from a minor glitch to a genuine puzzle. Where would a bus full of people go after entering the park at night? The speed limit was low, the roads winding and dark. It made no sense. Over the next few days, Eileen kept an eye on the traffic logs. The phantom bus never appeared on any of the park's exit sensors. According to the data, a large, unaccounted-for vehicle was still somewhere within Yellowstone's borders. It had come in, but it had never gone out. She started to dig deeper, reviewing surveillance footage from other key intersections within the park. She spent hours watching grainy, low-light videos of roads and junctions. She found nothing. The bus was a ghost in the machine, a single data point with no physical world correlate. The official NPS traffic monitoring report for that week mentions the discrepancy and attributes it to a sensor misread. The matter was officially closed, but for Eileen, the story felt unfinished. She couldn't shake the feeling that she had overlooked something. She went back to the original entrance footage, the one from that evening at 7:52 p.m. She watched it again and again, slowing it down, enhancing the contrast. And then she saw it. It wasn't a bus. It was a shadow. For a single frame, as a large pickup truck passed over the sensor, a second, much larger shadow detached itself from the truck's shadow. It was long, tall, and had the unmistakable shape of an old-fashioned tour bus, the kind with rounded edges and large panoramic windows that hadn't been used in decades. The shadow slid across the road, independent of any light source, and was gone in the next frame. It was a fleeting, almost subliminal image, a glitch in the fabric of the video itself. Eileen felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air-conditioned office. She was a rational person, a law enforcement officer who dealt in facts and evidence. But what she had seen was not a fact. It was an impossibility. She had found the phantom bus. It wasn't a real vehicle. It was a memory, an echo, a shadow that had somehow learned to trigger a magnetic sensor. She started researching the park's history, specifically accidents involving tour buses. She found a story from the 1950s, a tragic accident where a bus had gone off the road not far from the west entrance, lost in a sudden, unseasonable blizzard. There were no survivors. The accident had happened late in the evening, at almost the exact same time as her phantom bus had been logged. Eileen never mentioned the shadow she saw in the footage. Who would believe her? It was her own private, terrifying secret. She continued her job, counting the cars, monitoring the data. But now she knew that the numbers didn't always tell the whole story. She understood that the park had a memory, and that memory was sometimes strong enough to leave a trace, a ghostly data point in a modern surveillance system. And every evening, as dusk settled over the west entrance, she would find herself watching the road, half expecting to see a flicker of movement in the twilight, the silent, impossible shadow of a bus full of ghosts, forever arriving for a tour that had ended in tragedy more than half a century ago. The old service road, the backcountry of Yellowstone, is a web of contradictions. It is a pristine wilderness, untouched by the modern world, yet it is crisscrossed by a network of old, forgotten service roads, remnants of past projects and forgotten ambitions. For the park's maintenance crews, these roads are a constant challenge, arteries that need to be kept clear or, more often, decommissioned and allowed to be reclaimed by nature. In September of 1990, a crew led by a foreman named Gary Schmidt was tasked with repairing a long stretch of fencing in a remote section of the park. It was hard, manual labor under a hot autumn sun. They were using an old, faded Park Service map to navigate the network of unpaved roads. On their third day, while driving their heavy-duty truck to the worksite, they saw something that wasn't on the map. It was a dirt road, branching off from the one they were on. It wasn't a faint trail or an animal path. It was a clearly defined road, wide enough for a vehicle, with deep, fresh tire ruts cutting into the soil. Gary stopped the truck. He consulted his map again. There was no road marked here. He had driven this route dozens of times over the years and had never seen it before. "Must be new," one of his crew members said. "Maybe the fire crews cut it." It was a plausible explanation, but the road had an old, established look to it, as if it had been there for years, even though the tire tracks in it were undeniably recent. Curiosity got the better of them. They were ahead of schedule, so Gary decided to see where it went. He turned the truck onto the unmarked road. The ride was rough, the ruts pulling the tires from side to side. They drove for nearly a mile, the road winding through a dense stand of aspens. And then, as abruptly as it began, the road ended. It didn't peter out or become overgrown. It just stopped, spilling them out into a small, undisturbed meadow. There was no sign of a worksite, no logging operation, no reason for the road to exist. It was a road to nowhere. Even stranger, the fresh tire tracks they had been following also ended at the edge of the meadow. There were no turnaround marks, no indication that the vehicle that made them had ever left. It was as if it had driven to that exact spot and then vanished into thin air. Gary and his crew got out of the truck, a sense of unease settling over them. The meadow was unnaturally quiet, the air still and heavy. They took a few photographs of the road's strange terminus and the inexplicable end of the tire tracks. Not knowing what else to do, they backed their truck down the road and returned to their original task, the mystery of the road to nowhere, a topic of confused conversation for the rest of the day. The next morning, they had to drive the same route to get back to the worksite. When they reached the spot where the unmarked road had been, they were met with another impossibility. The road was gone. There was no turnoff, no cleared path, no fresh tire ruts. There was only the dense, unbroken line of the forest, exactly as it appeared on the map. It was as if the events of the previous day had never happened. Gary slammed on the brakes, his face a mask of disbelief. The entire crew piled out of the truck, staring at the spot where the road had been. It was impossible. A road, solid enough to drive a 2-ton truck on, could not simply disappear overnight. One of the younger crew members, pale-faced, summed up their collective fear. Did we dream that? But they hadn't dreamed it. Gary had the photographs. He had taken them with a disposable camera he kept in the glove box. When they got back to the maintenance depot at the end of the week, he had the film developed. The pictures were clear. They showed the unmarked road, the deep ruts, their truck parked at the edge of the quiet meadow. They were physical proof of a place that no longer existed. The road maintenance log from that week contains a brief, cryptic entry filed by Gary. It notes the discovery and subsequent disappearance of an unmapped and ephemeral service road, with photographs attached as evidence. The report was met with raised eyebrows and quiet skepticism. The official explanation was that a combination of shadows, heavy rains, and the crew's unfamiliarity with the area had created the illusion of a road and then erased the tracks. But Gary Schmidt and his crew knew what they had seen. They had driven on a road that should not have been there, a road that seemed to exist for only a single afternoon. The experience left them all with a deep and abiding sense of unease about the park's wild spaces. They learned that the maps they relied on were incomplete, that they only showed a single, static version of a landscape that was anything but. The chilling part for Gary was not just that the road had appeared and disappeared. It was the tire tracks they had followed. Who had been driving that road before them? Where had they been going? And what had happened to them when their vehicle reached the end of a road that led to nowhere? A road that the forest itself had decided to erase from existence? He had the terrifying feeling that they had stumbled upon a path not meant for them, a temporary doorway into a different, stranger version of the park, and that they had been incredibly lucky to find their way back. The visitor center tapes. The Yellowstone Heritage Center is a quiet, climate-controlled sanctuary for the park's history. It houses a vast archive of documents, photographs, and artifacts, a carefully curated memory of the park's past. For Clara, a young archivist hired in the winter of 2014, the job was a dream come true. She spent her days surrounded by the ghosts of the past, meticulously cataloging old records and preserving fragile pieces of history. Her current project was a daunting one, digitizing a massive collection of old VHS safety videos from the 1980s and 90s. It was a tedious task, a monotonous parade of grainy footage about bear safety, litter prevention, and the dangers of thermal pools. The tapes were poorly labeled, many of them in decaying cardboard sleeves. One afternoon, she picked up a tape that had no label at all. It was a generic black cassette, its plastic casing scuffed with age. Assuming it was just another misfiled safety video, she inserted it into the deck and pressed play. The screen flickered to life, but what appeared was not a cheerful, dated safety message. The footage was dark, clearly filmed at night. The camera was pointed at Old Faithful, its famous cone silhouetted against a starry sky. The quality was poor, typical of consumer-grade VHS cameras from that era, but the image was steady, suggesting the camera had been on a tripod. This was immediately strange. Nighttime filming in the geyser basin was, and still is, strictly controlled. It required special permits and a ranger escort. There was no record in the archive of any such permit being issued for this type of filming. As the tape played, The camera angle would occasionally change, cutting to different, unusual perspectives of the geyser. Some shots were from high up, as if filmed from the roof of the visitor center. Others were from low on the ground, dangerously close to the geyser's vent. These were not the standard, tourist-approved angles. They were the shots of someone who had access to the entire area, someone who was moving through the darkness with a quiet, intimate knowledge of the landscape. But the most unsettling part was the audio. There was no music, no official narration. Instead, there was a faint, almost inaudible sound buried beneath the tape's hiss. Clara put on a pair of high-quality headphones and turned the volume up. The sound was a voice, a man, whispering. The narration was not informational. It was poetic, strange, and deeply disturbing. He wasn't describing the geyser's geology. He was speaking to it, as if it were a living entity. "It breathes," the voice whispered, the words raspy and close to the microphone. "The old heart, it sleeps and it breathes. It remembers the ice. It remembers the fire. It waits for the signal." Clara felt a cold shiver run down her spine. The tape continued for nearly an hour, a mesmerizing and terrifying collection of nocturnal geyser footage, all accompanied by the same whispered, cryptic narration. The voice spoke of thin places, of the world beneath, and of a time when the fires would rise and cleanse the surface. It was the quiet, confident monologue of a true believer, a prophet of some strange, geothermal apocalypse. She searched the archives frantically, looking for any clue as to the tape's origin. It could have been a donated piece of media, something sent in by a visitor and accidentally mixed in with the official archives. But its presence felt more deliberate, more insidious than that. There was nothing. The tape had no official history. It was an orphan, a piece of rogue media that had somehow infiltrated the park's official memory. The Heritage Center's archive note for January 2014 simply records the discovery of one unlabeled VHS tape containing unauthorized nocturnal footage of Old Faithful. The tape was placed in a special collection for unidentified media, its strange, whispered secrets locked away in a box on a shelf. But Clara couldn't forget it. She had the audio digitized and would sometimes listen to it, trying to decipher its meaning. The voice was calm, almost soothing, but the words were filled with a chilling, fanatical certainty. She came to think of the filmmaker as a ghost in the archive, a silent observer who had managed to create his own secret document of the park. He had seen a different Yellowstone, not a place of natural wonder, but a place of immense, slumbering power. The most terrifying part for Clara was the realization that this person, whoever he was, had been out there, alone in the darkness, moving freely through one of the most dangerous landscapes on Earth. He had climbed to the roofs of buildings, set his tripod inches from a vent of superheated steam, all to capture these images and record his strange, whispered gospel. The tape was a testament to a faith she could not comprehend, and the final whispered words on the recording, spoken just as the geyser began a massive, powerful eruption, would haunt her forever. "It's waking up, and it's hungry." The Hayden Valley Fog Samuel Thorne was a wildlife photographer whose patience was legendary. He could spend days, even weeks, waiting for a single, perfect shot. His work was not about capturing animals. It was about capturing their essence, their place within the vast, indifferent landscapes they inhabited. In September of 2009, he was on assignment in the Hayden Valley, a sweeping, primeval expanse of grass and river that was home to some of Yellowstone's largest bison and elk herds. The weather had been stubbornly clear, the bright, high-altitude sun creating a harsh light that was ill-suited for the moody, atmospheric shots he was known for. He was hoping for fog. On his fourth morning, his wish was granted. He woke before dawn to find a thick, low-lying fog blanketing the entire valley. It was a photographer's dream, a perfect diffusion of light that would soften the landscape and create a sense of mystery and depth. He drove to a favorite overlook, set up his camera, and waited for the wildlife to emerge from the mist. The fog was strange, however. It wasn't a uniform bank of clouds. It moved in thick, isolated tendrils, snaking across the valley floor, appearing and disappearing with an unnatural speed. And there was a peculiar quality to it. It was visible primarily through his camera's lens. When he looked at the valley with his naked eye, it seemed relatively clear, with only a light haze. But when he looked through his viewfinder, the fog was dense, opaque, and roiling. He assumed it was an optical illusion, a trick of condensation on his lens or the way the long telephoto lens compressed the atmosphere. He ignored the strangeness and focused on his work. As the sun began to rise, a herd of elk emerged from a stand of trees, their powerful forms appearing as dark silhouettes in the mist. He began shooting, the camera's motor drive whirring as he captured hundreds of frames. He was so focused on the elk that he didn't notice the other forms at first. It was only later, back at his motel room, when he was reviewing the images on his laptop, that he saw them. In the fog, behind and around the elk, were other shapes. They were tall and unnaturally thin, standing motionless in the mist. They were not trees, and they were certainly not animals. They were vaguely humanoid, but their proportions were wrong, their limbs too long and slender. They were just dark, indistinct smudges in the gray fog, but they were undeniably present in dozens of consecutive frames. A cold dread washed over him. He checked the meteorological data for that morning. The park's weather stations had confirmed clear skies and high visibility across the entire Hayden Valley at the exact time of his photographs. There had been no fog. The dense, roiling mist that was so prominent in his images had not, according to official data, existed at all. The fog had only been on his camera, and the figures had only been in the fog. He went back through his images, his hands trembling. The shadowy forms were there, always in the background, never moving, just standing. They seemed to be observing the elk, silent, featureless sentinels in a fog that wasn't real. In some frames, as the elk moved, the fog seemed to move with them, clinging to the herd like a shroud, and the shadowy figures would reappear in new positions, always maintaining their distance, always watching. The submitted photograph sequence from that day became a point of minor contention. The magazine he was working for refused to publish the shots, assuming they were the result of a lens flare, a digital artifact, or outright manipulation. They were too strange, too unbelievable. Samuel knew they were real. He had been there. He had seen the fog through his lens. The photographs were not an anomaly. They were a record. He came to a terrifying conclusion. He had not photographed a weather phenomenon. He had photographed something else entirely, something that used fog as a form of camouflage, a portable environment that it could manifest and move at will. The elk were not just walking through the valley. They were being herded, watched over by silent, shadowy shepherds that were invisible to the naked eye. The Hayden Valley, which he had always seen as a place of raw, natural beauty, now seemed to him like a pasture, a feeding ground for entities he could not comprehend. His photographs were the only evidence of their existence, a chilling, accidental glimpse into a hidden world that operates just outside the range of normal human perception. He never went back to the valley. He couldn't. Every time he looked at its wide, open spaces, he could only imagine the invisible fog and the tall, thin figures standing within it, patiently watching, waiting, their silent presence a permanent, terrifying secret, hidden in plain sight. The Sulphur Spring watch field trips were the highlight of Mr. Jensen's year. As a high school science teacher from a small town in Montana, bringing his students to Yellowstone was an opportunity to make science tangible, to show them that the diagrams in their textbooks were pale imitations of the real, dynamic world. In May of 1998, he was leading a group of 16-year-olds on a late afternoon tour of the mud volcano area. The students, initially awed by the bubbling mud and sulfurous steam, were starting to grow restless as dusk approached. Jensen was trying to keep them engaged, explaining the chemistry of the acidic springs, when one of his students, a quiet girl named Jessica, pointed towards a small, unnamed sulfur spring just off the boardwalk. "Mr. Jensen," she said, her voice a mix of curiosity and fear, "that spring is on fire." Jensen followed her gaze. The spring was a small, milky green pool, bubbling languidly, but deep within the water there was a faint, orange glow. It wasn't a reflection. It was a light that seemed to be coming from inside the spring itself, pulsing with a slow, steady rhythm, like the embers of a dying fire. The other students gathered around, their chatter falling silent as they stared at the strange light. It was mesmerizing and deeply unnatural. Jensen, ever the scientist, tried to find a rational explanation. It was a reflection of the setting sun on the mineral-rich water, or perhaps a rare type of bioluminescent bacteria. But the sun had already dipped below the horizon, and he had never heard of bioluminescence in water this hot and acidic. He pulled out his camera, a simple 35mm film camera, and took several photographs, hoping to document the phenomenon for later analysis. As darkness fell, the glow became more distinct, its color shifting from a soft orange to a deeper, more fiery red. It seemed to dance and flicker in the depths of the pool, casting strange, moving shadows on the steam rising from the surface. A park ranger making a final sweep of the area approached them and asked what they were looking at. Jensen pointed out the light. The ranger watched the spring for a long moment, a frown on his face. He said he had never seen anything like it before. He made a call on his radio, and the official response was that there was no unusual geothermal activity recorded in that area. They were advised to leave the area, as being near thermal features after dark was against park regulations. The next day, Jensen contacted the park's geology department, described what he and his 16 students had witnessed, and offered to share his photographs once they were developed. The geologist he spoke to was polite but dismissive, explaining that optical illusions were common at dusk and that what they had seen was almost certainly a reflection. The park education program report from that field trip contains a brief, one-line mention of the event. Students observed an unusual light phenomenon in a sulfur spring, likely attributable to atmospheric reflection. It was a neat, tidy explanation that closed the book on the incident. But when Jensen got his photos developed a week later, he knew that the explanation was wrong. The photographs were chillingly clear. The faint glow he had seen with his own eyes was captured on film as a series of distinct, flame-like shapes deep beneath the surface of the water. They were not random glows. They were structured, licking forms that looked for all the world like a campfire burning at the bottom of the spring. Water and fire, two opposing elements, coexisting in a way that defied the laws of physics. He had captured photographic evidence of an impossibility. He sent the photos to the park, but he never received a response. The images were too strange, too hard to explain, and they were quietly filed away. Jensen was left with the photographs and the shared memory of his 16 students. They had all seen it. They had stood together in the twilight and watched a fire burning where no fire could be. The experience changed the way he taught science. He still taught the rules, the laws, the predictable certainties of the physical world. But he always made sure to add a caveat, a small footnote of humility. He would tell his students that the world was far stranger than the textbooks would have them believe, and that sometimes on the edge of darkness, in a place of great natural power, you might see something that breaks all the rules. He never told them the full story of the sulfur spring, but he kept the photographs in his desk, a private and terrifying reminder that there are some fires that water cannot quench. The Ranger Cabin. The job of a winter caretaker in Yellowstone is a vow of solitude. For 3 months, you are the sole human presence in a vast, snow-choked landscape. Your only company the wind, the wildlife, and the profound, crushing silence of the frozen world. In January of 1982, a young ranger named Will was on his first winter assignment, stationed at a remote backcountry cabin miles from the nearest plowed road. He was a capable outdoorsman, comfortable with isolation, and he saw the job as a test of his self-reliance. His days were a simple, rigorous routine. Check the snowpack levels, patrol the area on skis for signs of poachers, and maintain the cabin. The cabin was his fortress, a small, sturdy log structure that was his only shield against the brutal, sub-zero temperatures. He grew to know its sounds, the groan of the logs under the weight of the snow, the rattle of the window pane in the wind. One afternoon, Will embarked on a longer patrol, a 10-mile loop to check on a remote weather station. The day was clear and brutally cold. When he returned at dusk, exhausted and covered in frost, he saw a thin plume of smoke rising from the cabin's chimney. He stopped dead in his tracks, his hand instinctively going to the small revolver on his hip. He was the only person for 50 miles. There should be no smoke. His mind raced through the possibilities. Another ranger sent in for an emergency? A lost skier who had broken in for shelter? He approached the cabin cautiously, his skis crunching on the hard-packed snow. As he got closer, he saw that the heavy wooden door was shut, and the storm latch, a thick iron bar, was dropped into place from the inside. He was locked out of his own cabin. He circled the small building, peering into the single frost-rimmed window. The scene inside was both mundane and deeply bizarre. A fire was burning merrily in the wood stove, the one he had banked with coals that morning, which should have been long dead by now. His spare parka, which he had left hanging on a peg by the door, was now draped over the back of his chair. His tin coffee cup was sitting on the small table, steam rising from it. It was as if someone was waiting for him. "Hello?" he shouted, his voice sounding small against the vast silence. "Is anyone in there? This is the Park Service." There was no answer. He banged on the door, the sound echoing flatly in the cold air. Still nothing. The cabin remained silent, the smoke curling placidly from the chimney, a picture of domestic tranquility that was utterly terrifying. There was no way in without breaking down the door, a task he was not prepared to do unless it was a life-or-death emergency. Confused and deeply unnerved, he decided to ski to the nearest, emergency cache, a small shed 2 miles away where he could spend the night. He would return with backup in the morning. He spent a miserable, sleepless night in the frigid shed, his mind replaying the impossible scene at the cabin. The next day, accompanied by 2 rangers who had arrived by snowmobile, he returned to his post. The cabin looked exactly as he had left it the day before. There was no smoke from the chimney. The door was still locked from the inside. One of the senior rangers used a pry bar to force the latch. The door swung open into a cold, still room. The stove was cold, the ashes in the grate gray and dead. The parka was back on its peg by the door. The coffee cup was on the shelf, dry and empty. Everything was exactly as Will had left it before his patrol. The room was just as he had left it. The other rangers looked at him with a mixture of suspicion and concern. They checked the area for tracks and found only his. The official ranger field note from that day is brief and clinical. It mentions Will's report, but concludes that he was likely suffering from fatigue and mild hypothermia, which can cause vivid hallucinations. The relit stove was explained away as a freak occurrence, a shifting log catching a stray ember, a phenomenon known to happen in strong drafts. Will knew he hadn't been hallucinating. The image of the steam rising from the coffee cup was seared into his memory. He had been locked out of his own cabin by an invisible, silent occupant. He finished his winter tour, but the easy confidence he had once felt in the wilderness was gone. He felt like an intruder, a temporary guest in a place that had its own rules and its own unseen inhabitants. He became convinced that the cabin was not just a structure, but a space that held a memory, an echo of a previous caretaker who was still going about his daily routine. Setting the fire, preparing a cup of coffee, waiting for the ranger to return from his patrol. The chilling part was the lock. The entity in the cabin had not been hostile. It had prepared a warm room for him. But in its ghostly imitation of life, it had performed an action that had turned the sanctuary into a prison. It had locked the door from the inside, a simple, mundane act that had, for one terrifying night, left him on the wrong side of survival, shut out in the cold by a ghost who was just trying to be hospitable. The disappearing hot pool sound. Dr. Lena Petrova was a pioneer in a field most people didn't know existed: geothermal acoustics. She was a scientist who listened to the Earth's plumbing using highly sensitive underwater microphones, or hydrophones, to record the sounds of Yellowstone's hot springs and geysers. She believed that the acoustic signature of a thermal feature could predict its behavior, offering a new way to understand the complex, hidden systems beneath the park. In November of 2018, during the quiet season when the park was blanketed in its first snows, she was conducting research on a cluster of small, unnamed hot pools in the lower geyser basin. These pools were known for their constant, rhythmic bubbling, a sound she had come to know as the heartbeat of the basin. She had her equipment set up around one particularly active pool, a deep, cobalt blue vent surrounded by a fragile sinter shelf. Her hydrophones were submerged in the superheated water, cables running back to her recording station, a laptop and a mixing board set up on a portable table. For hours, the sound was exactly as she expected: a steady, percussive gurgling, a sound like a giant pot of water at a rolling boil. It was the sound of a healthy, stable thermal feature. The anomaly occurred just after 3 p.m. Without any warning, the sound stopped. It didn't fade out or diminish. It ceased instantly. One moment, her headphones were filled with the familiar, loud bubbling, and the next, there was absolute, profound silence. The change was so abrupt, so total, that for a moment she thought her equipment had failed. She checked her meters. The hydrophones were still active, the system was still recording, but the pool was silent. She took off her headphones and looked at the spring. Visually, nothing had changed. The water was still, its surface a perfect glassy mirror reflecting the gray, overcast sky. There was no steam, no ripples, no bubbles. The pool, which had been a cauldron of chaotic activity just seconds before, now looked as calm and inert as a puddle of rainwater. This was not just unusual. It was a violation of the laws of thermodynamics. The heat source that powered the spring hadn't been turned off. The pressure hadn't just vanished. Yet, the auditory and visual evidence was undeniable. The pool had gone silent. For 3 long, unnerving minutes, Lena watched and listened. The silence was more terrifying than any sound. It was the silence of a held breath, a moment of immense, unseen tension building just beneath the surface. She had the distinct and irrational feeling that the pool was watching her, that it had deliberately fallen silent because it knew she was listening. Then, just as suddenly as it had stopped, the sound returned. It came back not as a gentle bubbling, but as a single, violent explosion. A massive bubble of superheated gas and water erupted from the center of the pool, shooting a geyser of water 20 feet into the air. The explosion was so powerful, it sent a wave of boiling water crashing over the cinder shelf, drenching her expensive recording gear and forcing her to scramble backwards to avoid being scalded. The pool then immediately returned to its normal, rhythmic gurgling, as if nothing had happened. The entire event, the sudden silence, the tense pause, the violent eruption, had lasted less than 4 minutes. Lena was shaken, her heart pounding. She had just witnessed a behavior that had never been documented. The park's official audio archive for that day contains the recording, a unique and puzzling piece of data. The official explanation offered by her colleagues was a temporary gas blockage in the pool's underground conduit, which had built up pressure and then released explosively. It was a plausible theory, but it didn't feel right to Lena. The silence had been too perfect, too deliberate. A simple blockage would have resulted in a gradual decrease in sound, not an instantaneous cessation. The experience changed her perspective on her research. She had always thought of herself as a passive observer, listening in on a natural process, but now she couldn't shake the feeling that she had been noticed, that her act of listening had somehow provoked a response. It was as if she had been leaning in to hear a secret and the earth had suddenly roared in her ear to tell her to back away. Dr. Petrova continued her work, but she did so with a new and profound sense of caution. She had learned that silence is not always the absence of sound. Sometimes it is the sound of something listening back. And the chilling question that her recording could never answer was what had happened during those 3 minutes of perfect, unnatural calm, deep in the earth's hidden throat, as the pressure gathered for its single, violent, and unforgettable roar. The Canyon Bridge? The bridge that spans the Yellowstone River just above the Upper Falls is a feat of engineering. A concrete and steel ribbon suspended over a churning, violent gorge. For the road crews who maintain it, it's just another piece of infrastructure. A structure that requires constant vigilance against the relentless forces of erosion and weather. In the pre-dawn hours of a June morning in 1994, a crew led by a man named Hank was performing routine maintenance on the bridge's guardrails. The park was closed to traffic. the world silent except for the distant roar of the waterfall and the clanging of their tools. At precisely 4 a.m., they all heard it. It was the unmistakable sound of footsteps, heavy and rhythmic, crossing the bridge from the other side. They were slow, deliberate steps, the sound of heavy work boots on pavement, and they were coming directly towards the crew. Hank and his men stopped what they were doing, their tools falling silent. They looked at each other, then peered into the darkness at the far end of the bridge. They saw nothing, but the sound of the footsteps grew louder, closer. They could hear the crunch of gravel under the phantom boots, the steady, unhurried pace of someone walking with a purpose. A primal fear gripped the men. They were on a suspended bridge, high above a raging river, with something they could hear but not see walking directly towards them. There was nowhere to run. The footsteps continued, getting closer and closer until they sounded as if they were right in the middle of the crew. The men huddled together, their flashlights frantically scanning the empty span of the bridge. And then, the footsteps passed right through them, the sound continuing on its path towards the other side of the canyon, growing fainter and fainter until it disappeared into the darkness. The men were left in a stunned, terrified silence. They had all heard it. It was not a trick of the wind or an echo from the canyon. It was a shared, undeniable experience. Shaken, Hank radioed his supervisor to report the incident. He expected to be laughed at, to be told he and his crew were imagining things. But the supervisor's response was strangely calm. He told Hank to check the log from the seismic sensors. As part of a geological study, the bridge was fitted with highly sensitive vibration sensors, devices capable of detecting the slightest tremor in the structure. Hank, a man who trusted tangible data over ghost stories, went to the small monitoring shed at the end of the bridge and pulled up the sensor logs. What he found made his blood run cold. At exactly 4 a.m., the sensors had registered a significant vibration event. The data signature was not that of footsteps. It was the clear, unmistakable pattern of a heavy vehicle, something the size of a fully loaded construction truck, crossing the bridge at a slow, steady speed. He checked the footage from the traffic camera mounted at the end of the bridge. The time-stamped video from 4 a.m. showed a completely empty span. The bridge bathed in the eerie, low-light glow of its safety lamps. The data and the visual evidence were in complete, terrifying contradiction. The bridge had registered the weight of a massive truck, but the camera showed nothing was there. The Department of Transportation vibration sensor report from that day became a bizarre and classified document. It recorded an event that was physically impossible. A massive, invisible object had crossed the bridge. Hank and his crew never spoke of the incident again, at least not officially. But the story circulated among the road crews as a cautionary tale, a piece of modern folklore. They called it the ghost rig. The explanation Hank privately settled on was even more disturbing than a simple ghost story. He began to believe that the bridge was not just a physical structure, but a kind of antenna, a place where realities could occasionally overlap. He thought that perhaps, in another time, or another dimension, a truck really had crossed that bridge at 4 a.m., and for a few brief, terrifying moments, his world and that other world had bled into one another. His crew had heard the footsteps of the driver, while the bridge itself had felt the weight of his impossible vehicle. The experience left Hank with a profound respect for the strange energies of the canyon. He understood that the structures they built, the bridges and roads they thought they controlled, were just temporary impositions on a landscape far older and stranger than they could ever imagine. And sometimes, in the dead of night, when the world is quiet, those landscapes have a way of reminding you that you are not the only traveler on the road.